Well, I've been in the car hobby, let's see, since I was probably 14 years old. Bought the first car, which was a Volkswagen Beetle, when I was 14. And by the time I was 16, I'd had probably 3 or 4 Volkswagen Beetles at that time. Bought my first sports car at 16. It was an Italian car, and then got away from the Italian cars, a lot more expensive to work on, and started tinkering with English cars. And so then from there I went, I've had a wide variety of other things, but most of what I've had are English cars. And when you see all these half-finished projects in here, everything is English except the one hot rod that I have. This is 1972 88-inch wheelbase Land Rover, and it was sold new. I believe it was sold new in Alaska. It spent most of its life as a vehicle of an Alaskan wildlife photographer's. And I bought it, I think, in 2006 or 7 from a scrap metal dealer in Morganfield, Kentucky. And long story short, I got a call from somebody looking for an engine for a Land Rover, and I said, well, I might know where there's one at. So I was up in that part of the country, and I stopped and looked the guy up, and he said, rather than buy an engine, he said, I think I'd rather sell the Land Rover. And I said, well, I'd rather buy the Land Rover than find you an engine. And so I bought it. We get this out, and when I bought it, it did not have an engine, but I had an engine, actually. A good friend of mine had an engine, and I got it for it. And we get this out and drive in the farm here. We live on 28 acres. So, and my daughters love it. They call it Waldo because the logo on the side of the door, it's a little hard to read it, but it says, Alaskan Big Game Trophy Hunts, Walt Puckett, resident guide and wildlife photographer in Anchorage, Alaska. And we actually didn't know it said that till I got it home and we found the letters and found some documents that support it. But we call it Walt because of the name on it. We gave my daughters give vehicles a name, and they call it Waldo, which is for them short for Walt. So it's like, where's Waldo? But the Land Rover is a lot of fun. It's one of the only vehicles that I have that my wife didn't want me to sell, so she wants me to sell all the rest of them. But it's pretty neat. It's never been restored. It's totally original. The roof on it has never been off. And this is a 1960 Morris Minor Traveler, and they're very popular in Great Britain. They were sold in the U.S. until just a little while after that, and they quit importing the Morris Minor. Actually, Morris Minor Traveler 1000 is what this is called. Let me back up. But the Morris Minor is a really interesting vehicle. It's one of the only British vehicles they sold large numbers of. So it's often referred to as the equivalent to it's often referred to as the British Volkswagen, because Volkswagen Beetle at that time was sold all over the world. There were lots of places. But the Morris Minor was really popular in Great Britain. They're really popular collectibles in Great Britain and throughout the world too. The Traveler is the most desired, and it's an authentic woody. The wood is structural and required to hold the car together. It was in a house in a neighborhood in South St. Louis, Missouri, and the gentleman who had bought the house, he owned a company that bought houses and renovated them. He lived in Boston. The house he bought was in St. Louis, and they were getting rid of the contents of the house. He bought it as a lump sum, and he didn't even know what it was, and he listed on eBay, and I bid on it, and I went and I won the auction, and I went and got it. And the neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood, there was one neighbor who lived in the neighborhood 35 years, and they told me they never even knew the car was in the garage. It had never been out of the garage since he had lived in that neighborhood, which was 35 years. So when I got it and we rolled it out, it had not been out of the building since sometime in the early 1970s. But it's all original. It's never been restored. It does need a lot of work, but it's really interesting because most of the woody versions of the Traveler like this, they're usually in really bad shape or already gone. So it's an interesting vehicle. And I'm not sure what I'm going to do with it yet. My daughter calls it Henry. She says, because Henry's the name of the guy that I bought it from. So, but really interesting real interesting vehicle. Okay, so this is a 1974 Triumph TR6, and it's actually the newest car that I have, and it's the car I've had the longest of all the projects you see in here. But I've driven this car a lot of places and used to take on a lot of road trips. It's been apart for a while. I haven't made time to finish putting it back together. Decided to take it apart to do some work on it right before my oldest daughter was born, and then she came into the world, and everything just sort of stalled from there. But this car, I've had a lot of fond memories. I've taken a lot of trips in it. Probably my fondest memory was just a couple of days after 9/11. I took a trip to Oklahoma to a national meet, and I drove this car across the country. And on that trip, I say across the country to Oklahoma, which is a 11 or 12-hour drive. I went way out in Oklahoma in it, and which was a really memorable time. There was a lot of unease in the country at the time, and it was really neat to take a trip, just me in the car. And I've had this one, like I said, a long time. And long story short, it's a funny story how I bought it. It takes a long time to tell the story, but in a nutshell, I had a car for sale, and the guy that came to look at it, I said, "No, you don't want to buy the car I had because it wasn't a very good car." And he and I became good friends, and a year later he located this car and sold it to me. He really admired that I was honest with him about the car he was looking at, and so it's always meant a lot to me. And people ask me, if you had to sell all this junk, which one would you keep? If you could just keep one, it would probably be this car, because I've had it the longest, and I've been through a lot with it. So it's a really interesting history, and I probably spent the most on it too, so that factors in. I can tell you a little bit about it. It's really hard to tell what it looks like sitting up here. But this is a 1959 Triumph TR3, and just again a stalled project. I haven't worked on it in a while, but my wife and I bought this car together, and it was in a building, had not been moved from that building in a lot of years. And the owner took a liking to me as we talked about sports cars. He found out that I was an enthusiast, and he just wanted me to have it. So it was one of those, he knew he was getting older and he knew he wasn't going to get around to restoring it. And so, long story short, my wife Libby and I bought this one together. So it's actually not as far from being put back together as it seems. It's just sat here and collected dust for a while. So this is pallet shelving, like you'd see at Lowe's or at a hardware store somewhere where you put appliances. I rebuilt the pallet shelving to hold these two cars. The bottom one slides under here, but this is a 1964 Austin Healey 3000, and pretty special car. I've had 3 or 4 what were commonly referred to as big Healeys. That's the 6-cylinder version of the Austin Healey. And it's what most people, when they hear Austin Healey, it's the image that most people see, if you're familiar with what they look like. But this car is originally was a red car, and I may or may not ever restore it, but I've collected pieces for it. It's a really good investment car because the market's really high on them. And up above, you can't really see, but it's kind of red in color. This is the rarest car that I have. This is and it's actually in really rust-free condition for what it is. This is a 1954 Triumph, which is an English product, TR2, which is the earliest production of the Triumph sports car. What makes this car rare is it has a 3-digit VIN number on it. I think the VIN number on it is 321. And I'm on a couple of different databases of Triumph sports cars worldwide, and it's it's in one of the top 100 oldest Triumph sports cars in the world. And so it's like most of the other 100 old Triumph sports cars unrestored, because most of the other people who have them are like me. They hang on to them and don't do anything with them. But I bought this car. I'd been trying to buy it for a long time. An acquaintance of mine in Columbus, Ohio had it, and He'd owned it for a long time and just never did get around to restoring it. But I've been collecting a few pieces for it, and I may or may not ever get to restore it. It's a great investment car because globally, if they're a Triumph sports car enthusiasts, they would want this car because of its age. But to give you an idea, the Triumph sports car was introduced in North America on February the 7th, 1954. I'm sorry, January the 7th, 1954, and this car was manufactured on January the 6th, 1954. So it doesn't get any earlier than that. It's probably one of the first, probably one of the first 50 cars in North America. So it's really neat. But and it's in, like I said, for considering its age, it's actually in really good shape, and it's just got a lot of stuff stacked in here on it. But the custom-made pallet shelving holds it fine. So we were laughing about when you came in. I said, my building is, it's a lot of people look at it and say, oh, it's just a bunch of junk. And then within just a few minutes of being in here, it's kind of like a big I Spy book. There's just so much stuff stacked around and everything kind of crammed in here. But this car is, let me back up and tell you, everything you've seen is all English cars. This is the only American-made car that I have. And I've had several different hot rods that were American-made, most of them projects that I bought and traded or sold. But this is a 1935 Chevrolet Standard sedan. And this one is interesting because my parents growing up never wanted me to work on all these old cars, and it really made them nervous, and they were like, oh, you shouldn't be doing this. But it's a passion, it's something I love, and my father's often remarked that my passion for old cars probably kept me out of a lot of trouble as a kid. And he's probably right. But this is the only car, hot rod project especially, that I ever saw that he said, you need to buy that. That's really a neat car. It's really interesting. And it's all disassembled, but it's in remarkably good condition for what year it is. And like I said, it's a 35. And most of the time, these cars have a lot of wood in the inner structure in them. And most of the time, the wood rotted away by the late 1950s or 60s, early 60s, and the car was dismantled and sold for scrap. And so the survival rate is really low of this era of Chevrolet. So it's a potential hot rod project someday. Maybe when I retire, I'll have time to work on all these things. But there again, it's the kind of car that it doesn't really do anything, but they tend to go up in value. So it's worth sitting here for what that's worth. Okay, so this car is 1969 MGB, and MGB is the B is the larger style the MG produced at that time, and 69 is kind of a one-off model. They have a couple of unique features about them, but this car is all original on the exterior. It had the upholstery in it was done, and I actually went to appraise this car for a friend of mine, and my friend made the man an offer over the phone, and the guy that owned the car at the time said, what do you think? And I said, well, I think you can probably do better than that. And he heard me talking to the guy, and he said, well, you're an enthusiast. And so I said, yeah, I have a love for English cars, and one thing led to another. And he said, well, it's a kind of a long story, but he had inherited this car from a gentleman who died from cancer. And he said, my friend would want a true enthusiast to own the car. So he said, he made me an offer I couldn't turn down to buy it. And so I've had it, I guess, 3 or 4 years now. And my daughters love to ride in this car. It's a lot of fun to drive. And but it's pretty interesting because it's in such original condition. It's kind of beat and banged up and little nicks and scratches everywhere, but we do get it out and enjoy it. My cats sleep on it, which they shouldn't, but anyway, like I said, it stays in the garage here at the house, and It probably gets driven 800 miles a year or something like that, maybe. Not a whole lot. It only has 44,000 miles on it, so it's a really good, really low mileage for its age. So, but it is a 69 model. Just, it's a passion, and I'll probably never finish hardly any of these projects, but at the same time too, it's one of the things that gets me through life and makes me enjoy things from day to day, so there's not a lot else to tell about it.